pastors can kind of feel like, okay, I know this is an important spiritual issue, but I'm not an accountant. I don't understand macroeconomics. Like, I'm kind of afraid, to want to talk about this stuff because it's like not my area of expertise.
Right. Yeah, I feel that. I mean, how many times have we said, Rich Birch, I love the title of the podcast. I mean, unseminary.
Right.
It's like
something they don't teach you.
Yeah. How many times are we like, man, the things that we really needed to know and that's not a knock on seminaries. I mean, they're teaching us what you're talking about, the Bible part and the people part, but there's so much leadership and practical stuff that comes along with it. So I feel that, like, I could, I wish there was more church finance type stuff taught, but what you're saying is even higher than that. It's more just like, basic financial acumen. I saw a quote the other day that I thought was pretty good. I was reading back through some of my notes from a book I'd read, and it said another name for complex is unfamiliar. Mm-hmm. Things that you feel like are so complicated, once you get to know them more and more and more, they become less complicated, And I think that a lot of times it's just straight up fear of the unfamiliar. It's fear of the complexity. I mean, you're right. There's a lot of people, pastors, you can grow up blue collar, man, finance is something somebody else does. Almost like you kind of have a notch in your cap about your lack of awareness around it. I also think that a lot of that, like, man, I'm unfamiliar with that, so I just don't learn about it. Like, if you read the book, The Oz Principle, that is just firmly deciding to stay under the line and being a victim. Over the line is take responsibility. Under the line is victimhood. And it's so crazy. We all go, man, I'm not a victim. All of us do victimhood. And I think a lot of that idea of just like, man, I don't really know about that. That's for some Wall Street high person, That's just deciding I'm just going to stay under the line and not take responsibility for this area of my life.
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Breaking Barriers podcast. My name is Pastor Bobby and I got Pastor Andrew here, and today we're going to be doing an episode talking about our role as pastors when it comes to generosity, money, funding the vision, and all of that stuff. I think it's a very important topic. Breaking Barriers is all about helping churches grow so that they can go. And anytime a church grows, there's going to be tons of needs when it comes to funding the vision. But then also, we're going to talk about some that it's a need in people's hearts too, to talk about money, to talk about generosity, to live with open hands. And so specifically today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about 5 reasons that pastors sometimes can get kind of hung up and honestly not wanting to talk about giving, not wanting to talk about generosity, not wanting to identify, hey, here's how much money we're trying to raise. And so hopefully what we could do in offering some of those hangups that we all experience, maybe they can end up maybe freeing up 1 or 2 of these things in your life. If you have one of these hangups that's maybe keeping you from going after the vision that God's put in your heart for your church. So I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Andrew to just kind of introduce this idea of generosity in the church.
Yeah, I think that one of the quickest ways that we can see decline or just a failure to kind of get off the ground and launch, so to speak, with things like generosity or any other initiatives that we want to do in the church. A lot of times we over-spiritualize things that are supposed to be practical. And when we over-spiritualize something that's supposed to be just kind of a practical, good practice, and man, it's best practice, and man, it works, and it's leadership oriented or it's strategic or whatever, and we're kind of constantly trying to over spiritualize those things, we end up sort of demonizing anything that we don't have a verse for. And it's just a real shame, because any kind of growth in churches, no matter what you look at, there's going to be a great spiritual component of it, and then there's going to be a great practical component of it. And you see it in the scripture too. Like, man, we have a problem. We need to serve tables. Okay, well, we're going to do this. You guys are going to do that. We're going to do it this way. Seems like there was a lot of strategy to Paul's missionary movements, for example. Like, there's just a spiritual component, there's a strategy component, and if we don't have an attention to both of those things, I think we're really not going to be served well or serving our people well. I mean, you and I carry the label pragmatist in a positive way. Like, we just feel like We're consecrated pragmatists. We're gonna make sure that we're doing the spiritual side and make sure that we're staying right by the book in terms of the Bible. But beyond that, we want to do. Everybody does practical. We want to do it really well. And so when it comes to generosity in the church, man, there is a deeply spiritual side to it. That it's about discipleship. And then there's also a deeply practical side to it, where when you look at movements that are blowing and going,
costs money,
man, they're spending money left and right, and they don't have a scarcity mindset around that stuff. Man, they think God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. He wants to deploy his resources for his kingdom. We're going to go after it. We're going to set goals with numbers. We're going to try to do big vision with our people. We think they're going to grow, and the mission is going to go. One of the things that we say at Mercy Hill is that in the economy of God's kingdom, what takes the mission the farthest also takes the disciple the deepest. And so it's like when we think to ourselves, man, this is just all practical. It's all about church growth. It's like, man, well, you're missing the part that the same thing that makes the church go the farthest is going to take the disciple the deepest. There's something about generosity in God's kingdom that is a very apt tool for discipling the believer and for fueling God's mission.
Yeah, totally. And, before we get into those 5 kind of hang-ups that pastors and church leaders can have, kind of piggybacking on what you're saying, a lot of what Breaking Barriers in the ministry is, there are things kind of out there in the conference circuit that when people say, we talk about kind of being this like anti-church growth sort of thinking. There's things when people say that the average pastor sitting there listening, is like, oh, that's good. Like, man, that's so good. But some of those things are just not correct,
Right.
But they sound really good, And I think there's this kind of idea when it comes to fundraising, generosity, the role in the church and the role the pastor has with this stuff. There's a tendency to think, man, if your church is more spiritual, if you are more spiritual as a pastor, you just need to leave that stuff up to God, what people are going to give. And you need to not like identify, hey, here's how much money we're trying to raise or whatever. And like, you just need to trust God with this stuff. And it's like, okay, that can sound like a really good sort of thing, but we don't really view it that way. We certainly agree that you need to leave it to God when it comes to the outcome, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything as pastors, because this is a very important issue.
Right. I mean, when any faith component has a works component. Like anything that you are doing that is a trust God, it has a downstream effect of what that faith looks like in the world, what it looks like to act out. And I think it's just funny because you bring up a really good point. It feels like generosity more than some of the other things. It's just like, man, but we don't want to talk about the action component of it or the faith component of it. Like, I think about it with evangelism. I mean, how would we say it's like super spiritual to just not have any action components with evangelism? Just trust God, Like, well, if a church said like, well, hey, we're going to do like this thing on a weekend with a block party and try to share the gospel. No, that's a lack of trust. I'm like, no, I think that shows they are trusting.
Right.
Trying to get your faith moving in the world, to me, feels like it's an evidence of, you're trying to put your faith on display and it shows a big faith. Some kind of way with generosity, you're right. It turns into, I don't want to know what anybody in the church gives. That's a real common, like, super spiritual one. We're not going to set goals around money at all. We're not going to talk about it from the stage at all. Like, we're not going to do that because we're trusting God with it. When none of our other spiritual disciplines really work that way.
Right. Yeah, one of the things I was thinking about, like for us in this podcast, one of the things we have on the front page of our Breaking Barriers website, it's just like a phrase that says, like, we're pastors, not consultants, and we love church consultants. I think they're important for different things. But when it comes to like generosity and raising funds, I do think it's different giving advice from the chair of being a pastor versus just giving advice as a consultant. Because for us, it's like we're actively doing this stuff. You know what I mean? Like we're not on the outside saying, hey, here's 3 good principles, whatever. A lot of these fears and different hangups we may share are stuff that we've dealt with over the years. You have been in your role for 13 years and have probably seen this from different sides and have probably struggled with some of this, in different
Right.
ways. Maybe even just before we get into some of the hangups, like what's been that journey like
Right.
for you, and generosity?
I think, yeah, totally. I mean, we're coming from a practitioner's heart here. For me, the concept of people saying like, man, I've always had a problem talking about money. I don't like to talk. That was never really true for me but I think it was only half. I think the glass was only half full in that for me, because I definitely understood very early on that the mission of God, we say it, we got this from Church of the Highlands. The mission is going to go about as far as the generosity the church takes it. Okay. I never had the language for that, but that was true from day one. It's like, man, if the one thing that we need more than anything else is more money. And I knew that. And so for me, like talking about money to raise money for the mission was not really ever an issue for me. I think my big evolution has come, Bobby, with over the last few years of realizing how important this is for the individual growth of the believer. And I know we'll talk about that here in another podcast, but for me, that movement from, okay, generosity is the product of maturity, and moving from that to, wait, no, I think generosity is a pathway to maturity also. That like, if I want to see someone's discipleship go the deepest, one of the first conversations we need to have is around their generosity.
Right.
Not the last conversation we're going to have.
Right. Yeah, that brings us to some of these hangups that pastors have. So, we just kind of came up with this list off the top of our head, stuff that we've heard people say, stuff that we have felt, and I'm sure there's way more reasons than this, but just nice, clear kind of 5 of them today. So one of them, and we just recently heard somebody kind of bring this up, and we've dealt with this before. So at Mercy Hill, like, when we're talking about generosity, we're talking about, generosity fuels the mission. It's not just from the stage, but it's also in one-on-one conversations with people. And, one hang up that I know pastors have, because we have said this, and I've heard a lot of pastors say this, is like, man, I don't want to show partiality to somebody. I don't want to show partiality to somebody that either has more money, or somebody that, is, extremely generous, or God's blessed, or they're an entrepreneur or whatever. Like there's some hesitancy, like, hey, if I talk with somebody one-on-one, I may be going down that road of showing partiality. What would you say in terms of, like, we just were recently engaging with somebody over this?
Man, I think it's an incredibly common fear. I think people will say like, man, I'm afraid that I will, which to me, that's a really, when people say like, I'm afraid I'll become, buddy or partiality or whatever, I'm like, the first thing that comes to my mind is, man, we try not to do decision-making based off of fear. So when someone says the phrase, I'm afraid I'll whatever, it's like, well, that probably is a good reason to stop for a second and think about it. To me, we got to acknowledge that, the Bible talks about partiality and ushering the rich person to the front for a reason.
Right.
Every one of us are susceptible to that and capable of that. But I would also say, you don't get to just take your ball and go home, Right. Like if the Bible also tells you, as Paul, as we see Paul say to Timothy, like, hey, you need to teach the rich to be rich in good works. Well, how are you going to teach them to do that if you refuse to even know who they are or ever even have any kind of interaction with them? I'm scared of that person because God's blessed them. It's like, man, to me, that's not really reflective of the heart of a pastor. It sounds super spiritual, but at the end of the day, it's like, man, I'm not sure about that. It feels more like the heart of a pastor should be, man, these people God has given, a lot of times the gift of generosity and the gift of making money go together. They just sort of do.
Right.
God has given these people something to steward, and as a pastor, I want to help them with that. I want to know them. If that turns into someone has their own parking space at your church in the very front, you probably got a problem.
Right.
Okay. But if you have the heart of, actually, I'm probably over the course of this person's life and ministry here at our church, I'm going to be like throwing a huge vision at them and see if they respond to it. And man, I'm going to be asking very hard, deep things of them in a way that may even be different than the way I just cast it in general.
Right.
Then I think the idea of like, man, I'm not even going to know who they are is, it sounds great on the conference circuit. And as soon as you put the screws to it, to me, it falls apart.
Yeah. Yeah, I like how you frame it, because I think there is a risk, and it's not just money. There's a risk. Anybody shows up to your church and they're incredibly gifted, there's going to be a risk that you show them partiality, right? I mean, any of us, right? Like tomorrow, if some famous NFL player shows up to our church and wants to be a member, it's going to be very easy to want to show that person partiality because they have this amazing gift that God's given them. I think our role as pastors is to say, okay, I need to help them to steward that, and I need to challenge them to steward that. That's very different than showing them partiality and ushering them to the front.
Right.
And just because there is a risk to show somebody partiality because you've identified their gift is not a reason to not actually help them to steward their gift and to actually pastor them.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and apply, exactly right. And apply that to any other leadership role in the whole church. Like if I said, hey man, I don't spend any more time with our missionaries or our church planners or our, small group leaders because I don't want to show partiality, we'd be like, well, that don't sound right.
Right.
It kind of sounds like these people are putting their whole freaking life on the line, and they're leaning in, and God's gifted them, and maybe those are some high impact situations you need to spend some time with. It's again, man, it's just this whole thing where we just have this faux pas because it's about the gift of generosity. I mean, the Bible is as clear as day in Romans 12. Generosity is a gift. There are people who God has gifted to be generous. And I just can't imagine just deciding wholesale, we're just going to mute that one because we're so scared that we're going to be drawn in and we're not going to be. It's like, man, if we have a problem with showing partiality, that's something we need to do like any other sin or temptation in our life. We need to share it with each other. We need to repent of it. We don't just stop and mute an entire group of people's giftings in our church, I think.
Right. So another hang up I think that we as church leaders can have is that in talking about generosity, because it is, and I don't know that people would frame it like this, but this is the reality of it. Talking about money and generosity is a beeline to the heart.
Right.
And because that's the case, people absolutely will get offended.
Yes.
And some people, maybe they have wounds from that, and they just don't want to deal with that.
That's exactly right.
And so there's a hesitancy.
Right. Yeah, I love the illustration we got from the guys 1122 that, the Crusaders would be baptized with their sword out of the water before a battle. Now, getting baptized before you go in battle, that's a whole problem theologically anyway. Okay. But the idea was they hold their sword out of the water because they know they're going to sin with that. And the illustration that those guys 1122 say is that's our culture today. We're baptized with our wallet out of the water. I would say I would add to it and say, man, our wallet and our sexuality are two things. And it's like, man, if you start pushing on that, people are going to come out of the woodwork. They're going to be offended. You're going to get emailed or whatever. But that's one of those things to me where it's like, man, as a pastor, we've signed up to be on the front lines of spiritual war. And if we know this gets such at, in the way that sexuality is getting at our identity now in a way that maybe it never has before because of, just some of the moves and turns in culture, it feels a little bit like that with money that, man, we start talking about money, it gets at such a deep place very fast that you're going to catch flack for it. But that probably is a sign that you're doing something right.
Right.
Not that you're doing something wrong.
The way that I would say is to encourage maybe a younger pastor, that's planning a church or something. It's like, yeah, you are going to offend people, but it's a good offended, because what it's going to do is, there's some people that's not going to be offended at all because they're super bought into the vision, and it's going to allow you to know, okay, man, these people right here are really going after the vision. Some people are going to be offended because they need to grow, and God's going to use it to grow them, which is
we've seen that.
That's great. That's what you want to, you're challenging somebody because maybe it's an issue in their life where they're holding their hands too tightly around their money. Other people are going to be offended, and man, they probably are not kind of part of your church, and like they're going to leave, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, some of those people, honestly, they're not even believers, and it's God's revealing, kind of just more of a religious inclination. Yeah. I think that's a lot of the reason Jesus talked about money too, because religious people, like, Man, they got a lot of the good works, but you start talking about money and you start going after that, you start touching something really, really deep.
Yeah, I mean, as we say, a hit dog will holler. And I'm not sure if you understand that.
I do.
You struggle with
I understand
figures of
that,
speech.
though.
But yeah, the idea is like, man, you start talking about money and you just end up, you got you got someone that has a stingy heart, and God wants to break that open and see all the other things that he wants to flood into their life and to see from their life. But it's probably going to be some pain, first. And
Right.
so a lot of times the people that are reacting,
Right.
man, it's funny, man. People that are like faithful in their giving and excited about the mission, like 99.9% of the time, I just feel like they're just like excited about this stuff.
Yeah.
Because they see it. They're
Totally.
like, yeah, man, like most of them are like, dude, if we all got on board, we might have a bigger impact,
Imagine what we could
And
do.
yeah, so they don't,
Yep.
it's a lot of times it's the people that are not with you that
Yep.
are going to get mad.
Yeah, so the next two hangups, these are, I think, things that pastors deal with just personally. One of them is the same heart issue that people have with money. Money can provide security. Money can make us feel like we're in control. Some of those same issues that people in the congregation are going to have, pastors have too, because we're humans just like everybody else. And so, instead of really going after it,
Right.
trying to raise money for this huge vision that God's put on your heart, because a pastor has some of those same issues, there can be a hesitancy because it's hard to take someone on a journey that you're not willing to go
Right.
on yourself.
Right.
And I know the way you're wired, you're a very like earnest sort of person where it's like, man, the heart and what you're encouraging people to do
Right.
has to match
Yeah.
up.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's just no way I could be on a stage leading the church if I didn't honestly in my heart feel like, man, we've gone first. Now that doesn't mean we've sacrificed more than anybody else in
Right.
the whole church, whatever, but
You're on the journey.
I've got to be on the journey and I need to be on the front end of that journey.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's right. I think
Totally.
that's what leadership is. We're creating a pathway for people to follow. So, but I will tell you just a quick story. You know this already, but like I remember how hard this was when we did the very first giving initiative we've ever done was called For His Name. We were trying to upfit our second space that we were ever in. So we moved from a clubhouse to a little small area. We're trying to upfit a bigger area of that same complex we were in. And, our church was very young, not a whole lot of people, mostly college students. So we didn't have a lot of money. We were trying to raise I can't remember what it was, $800,000. Yeah, $600,000 or something outside of our budget, to be able to go in, and it was going to be like a 1-year deal. And I was so excited about all that. Like I remember I went and preached a camp, and I had I was reading Fresh Wind, Fresh Fire. I remember calling you, just being like, dude, we just got to like go for it. And but running in the background of that whole thing, to your point here, is I also knew that me and my wife were planning on kind of making that switch for her to not work outside the home. And, our church, the church plant's 2 years old, and Anna came here and got a job. That was kind of what it took. And, man, our kids were little and they were going to daycare. It's like, man, we had to make ends meet or whatever, but we had been trying to be smart, and I had been trying to do some stuff outside of the church and all that. And we were getting to that place where it was like, all right, we're about to make that switch. And, to use Dave Ramsey's thing, like the boat's getting just about close enough to the dock, to jump. And boom, then For His Name comes around, and I'm like, dude, I know what we're going to do in terms of trying to give more and sacrifice more. And so I just think like two things. Number one, to act like that's not a reality. Everybody hearing this, you're a pastor, like there is a personal financial situation that's going on. And you are making the decision to put yourself in the front line of something like that. That's number one. Number two, I think that potentially though, man, because that's the case, God has the opportunity maybe to do more in you, pastor, than just about anybody else. Because you're not only the congregation hears this vision. They have to decide whether I'm buying into it or not.
Mm-hmm.
Like the pastor is the one deciding, are we even going this route or not? Like, are we even going to go down this road or not? So I have felt personally, and I mean, we went all in on For His Name, and I feel like God just opened our hearts and blessed us immensely, and we were able to give. And so, but it truly was a spiritual moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Another reason that I think pastors can have hesitancy around fundraising, generosity, trying to fuel the vision God's given them is for whatever reason. I mean, people come at this from different angles, but maybe it's because they're coming from a blue collar background, or maybe it's because, they only went to Bible college and nothing else. Like sometimes pastors can feel like, man, I don't have like the financial literacy to be talking about money and to be fundraising and to be trying to identify, a $500,000 vision and what things are going to cost. And I don't know that anybody would ever say, I don't have the financial literacy to do that. But I think sometimes what's happening sometimes is, pastors can kind of feel like, okay, I know this is an important spiritual issue, but I'm not an accountant. I don't understand macroeconomics. Like I'm kind of afraid, to want to talk about this stuff because it's like not my area of expertise.
Right.
But maybe you could help explain. There is a difference though of like being like an, economics guy and like just being a pastor and challenging people biblically, at the heart level. Because what we should be as pastors, we're like experts at human beings, in the way God's created us and the fallenness that we all deal with. Like you don't got to be a CPA to be able to talk about money with people.
Right. Yeah, I feel that. I mean, how many times have we said, Rich Birch, I love the title of the podcast. I mean, unseminary. It's like
something they don't teach you.
Yeah. How many times are we like, man, the things that we really needed to know were, and that's not a knock on seminaries. I mean, they're teaching us what you're talking about, the Bible part and the people part, but there's so much leadership and practical stuff that comes along with it. So I feel that like I could, I wish there was more church finance type stuff taught, but what you're saying is even higher than that. It's more just like, basic financial acumen. I saw a quote the other day that I thought was pretty good. I was reading back through some of my notes from a book I had read, and it said another name for complex is unfamiliar. Mm-hmm. And that's really true. It's like, man, things that you feel like are so complicated, once you get to know them more and more and more, they become less complicated, Mm-hmm. They at least feel less complicated,
good way to think about it.
And I think that a lot of times it's just straight up fear of the unfamiliar. It's fear of the complexity. I mean, you're right. There's a lot of people, pastors, country pastors, you can grow up blue collar, man, finance is something somebody else does. Almost like you kind of have a notch in your cap about your lack of awareness around it. It's like, man, I'm just a good old grits and country boy and all that. And I'm kind of that way a little bit. But I also think that a lot of that, like, man, I'm unfamiliar with that, so I just don't learn about it. Like if you read the book, The Oz Principle, that is just firmly deciding to stay under the line and being a victim. Over the line is take responsibility. Under the line is victimhood. And it's so crazy. We all go, man, I'm not a victim. All of us do victimhood. And I think a lot of that idea of just like, man, I don't really know about that. That's for some Wall Street high person, that's just deciding I'm just going to stay under the line and not take responsibility for this area of my life. When there's very simple things we can do, man. I mean,
yeah,
you can there's simple books you can read. There's simple podcasts you can follow to just kind of gain a little bit of awareness around a lot, some of this stuff that then I think when you're trying to do the Bible part and the heart part, you have a lot more tools in your hand because you understand some of the conversation and some of what people are dealing with.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I remember when we started having to try to, we were always raising money, like people were giving, tithing, but like we actually had to identify like $600,000 vision, or we're doing this. I just remember it's like you could feel like, oh my gosh, what is a balance sheet? You know what I mean? Like what are assets? Like what are liabilities? Like, just all this stuff. Like what's our debt service coverage? Like what type of loan are we getting? And feeling like you need to be able to answer any question that anybody has. And I do think it's really good to try to educate yourself. And there's people in the church, honestly, finance people and different people that a lot of times are happy to try to help you understand and simplify things for you. And but you don't got to have a PhD in that stuff to be able to talk about why giving is important.
Yeah.
Hey, the last one is, and these are not really in any particular order, but like, I think sometimes we have a fear of and I feel like I feel like we both understand this one a lot. Like we have a fear of, hey, when we try to really go after it and put a fine point on our vision of like, here we're going, this is where we're going, this is how much it's going to cost, this is what we're going to do. There's some people in the church that didn't realize that was our vision. And by putting that fine point on it and like printing stuff up and handing stuff out, like we're going to come under like more scrutiny. And our vision's going to come under more scrutiny. And that can just be hard to deal with.
Yeah.
Sometimes, you know?
Yeah.
Putting numbers on things and how much stuff's going to cost and where we're going. And
Yeah.
But I mean, what are some of the things you've done to try to help kind of get over that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the probably the biggest thing is just to realize that like trust that's accumulated over years, it really comes to play when you're talking about money and you're talking about like what's the next 5 years vision and that kind of thing. Because there is a spirit a little bit, there can be of different people who are just the very rules oriented. They're very Ronald Reagan, like trust but verify people.
Right.
And that's fine. That can, but generally speaking, I think once you've come through on vision that you've cast and you've done that over and over and over, and you've seen the Lord do it and you did with the money what you said. Hey man, we're going to buy a building and start a worship academy. And then it's 5 years later and there's a building and a worship academy or whatever. You know what I mean? I think to me, that's the number one way, that you can, I think kind of move through that season. But there's no doubt, especially if you've done kind of the bad thing, which is you hyper spiritualized a pragmatic issue. Mm-hmm. And so you literally have said out loud to the church things like, we're not going to have a budgeting goal, or we're not going to ever throw out these numbers like this, or you've done that in practice. The first few times you decide you were wrong and you start doing it, you're going to get pushback.
Right.
But that's okay. It's like, man, if you want to get strong, you got to pick up stuff that's heavy. So it's just going to be one of those seasons of growth.
Yeah. I think one of the things that we've done over the years, I don't know where this came from. Maybe you just came up with the phrase, but like we've tried to be on like the edgy side of wise,
right?
Because with like putting a vision out there, and like there's a couple different tendencies I think with pastors. One is, hey, if people have low expectations, no one's ever going to be disappointed. So I'm just not going to put anything out there, right? Like, man, I'm not going to disappoint anybody. I'm not going to say we're trying to do this or whatever. It's like, okay, that's not where we want to be, On the other side, and sometimes pastors can be the worst about this, like just they want to have this crazy faith and they just start throwing out there, we're doing this and we're doing this and we're doing this and we're doing this. And like they do 0 out of 10.
Right.
You know what I mean? And that's where the leadership trust with people can start to kind of like, okay, man, when this guy says we're doing X, Y, Z. So you want to have some balance of like, hey, we want to trust God. We want to challenge people. We want to try to go after stuff that God is going to have to bless, that we can't just in our human effort. But there does need to be like a balance there of there's a reasonable, hey, our elders or our staff team or whatever think, hey, with prayer and fasting and good leadership, there's a reasonable chance that this is going to be able to happen. Yeah,
for sure. And I think that to me, you really start centering on that idea of pragmatic again, because it's like, okay, we have this vision, man. We want to see 5,000 people baptized, 500 people sent out. People are like, oh, did God give you that vision? Well, what do you mean? Like, I've got a book that tells me to go in that direction. That's our direction. Hey, we're going to raise X amount of money for this building. Well, did God like give you that vision like in a dream or something? I'm like, no. I mean, I'm not saying he couldn't, but like our numbers for the building that we're building, it's like, man, that wasn't like a dream. I'm like, well, I think we're supposed to make disciples to the end of the earth. This seems like a really good next step. I've been thinking about this a lot, praying about this a lot. This is, man, God, we're going to put this out there. I don't know if you're going to do it. It's a prayer goal.
Yeah.
More than it is like, something God just, kind of gave me a spirit, special, like I'm Moses on the mountain or something, So I think that it is a very practical thing that we're doing for a very spiritual reason. Mm-hmm. We want to point our people toward the direction we feel like God wants us to go, based on the scripture. And we're going to try to put some language around that and a picture in their mind, and then ask them, hey, give toward that.
Yep. Yeah, and I would say for most pastors, just to kind of summarize all of this, I would say for most pastors, they probably need to be thinking about this stuff more.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, in my experience, somebody plants a church or a church starts growing or something starts happening. A lot of times the thing that ends up happening is people realize very quickly, man, we don't have enough. There's not enough money.
Right.
You know what I mean? Man, I need to hire more staff because God's growing this thing like crazy. Oh, we don't have enough money. Like I need to plant a campus, or we need a bigger building, or we need more seats. Oh, we don't have enough money.
Right.
And so generosity is a very, very important for everybody in discipleship, but especially like if the church is growing, like you don't want to wait, like you don't want to begin to kind of build that well once you actually like need sort of the water of it. You know what I mean? Like even before you feel like you really need it, you need to start thinking about these things and thinking about just the importance of the role of a pastor when it comes to generosity and people's development.
Absolutely.
So, all right. Awesome, man. Good episode.